Okay, we're going to go through the monthly inspection of the facility. I'm using as the outline for that the Above Ground Storage Tank Operator Handbook, which has a monthly inspection form. You should, prior to performing this task, you should review your procedures, operating manual that you have specific to your facility. There may be additional features that you need to be aware of in your facility. This one is fairly general, and we're just going to go through it. There's a copy of the typical checklist included in this video for you to use also. So the first item on the checklist is called housekeeping. Basically, the tank farm area needs to be clean of any combustible material, any trash, any unnecessary items. So we're going to inspect the entire facility, the dispensing area, the tanks, the bulk storage area, the truck loading area, look for any things. And so as we look around here, our operators left a few things behind. There's some leftover sorbent material, looks like a Pepsi can, a chunk of 2x4 they must have been using for something. So we're going to get that stuff out of here, make sure the whole area is clean and secure. Okay, our next item on the checklist is safety, and this would incorporate the fire extinguishers, would be one of the first items. So we need to make sure that all the required fire extinguishers are in place. Check the levels, make sure they're all charged and ready to go. Any fire extinguishers that have fallen below the green level need to be recharged or replaced. Okay, the next item on our inspection will be the signage. So we're going to make sure that all of the required signs are in place, and it's a good idea to check them, make sure they're still firmly attached, they're not coming loose. And it's also a good idea on the monthly inspection just to review the signs, make sure we're familiar with all the requirements. Some of them will have specific instructions, and it's just a good idea to make sure we're familiar with that and the specific detailed messages that are contained in those. Okay, the next item on our checklist is security, and the first thing we want to check is the fencing. It's probably the most essential part of keeping the facility secure. We check the barbed wire, make sure it's all tight and in place on its hangers. Check all the fence fabric and fittings, make sure everything is tight and sound. Check the bottom, make sure the tension wire is in place. Now here in this, it looks like the ground is settled in this area. We're getting some clearance there. This would allow animals to get in under the fence. It'd be a good idea to come in with a load of gravel and fill that back in, close up that gap just to make sure we're secure. Then we want to check all of the gates too, and we want to make sure that the gates operate freely, that the latches don't hang up, that they'll latch properly and lock solid. And check all the locks. It's a good idea. These locks have a tendency to hang up in the weather. You might want to oil the locks periodically, keep them operating freely. And it looks like this one's got a little rust on it, and so it probably needs oiled. May need replacement at some point in time if it becomes inoperable. Okay, the next item we're going to check is lighting. Pretty much all tank farms would be equipped with some kind of area lighting. This is provided for nighttime operations, should you need to do that, and for detecting spills and vandalism. So you want to check, make sure the lighting works. Most of the lighting systems are equipped with photocell controls, so you may have to check these early in the morning or late in the day when you can do it. And then verify that the lighting works, and then in many facilities the lights are left off when the facility is not in use, just to save power consumption and to attract less attention to the tank farm. Okay, the next item on our checklist is the tanks. We're going to give the tanks a thorough visual inspection. One of the things, all the tanks should be equipped with a product and capacity label. This one looks like it's beginning to peel, something you want to keep an eye on. If you start to lose that labeling, you'd have to replace it. You can either paint it with stencils or get vinyl letters to replace that with. Then we want to give the entire tank a thorough visual inspection. Check the weld joints for any signs of weeping or leaking. You would see it kind of dampness if it began to start to weep. Check the paint for any corrosion, peeling, flaking. You just want to make sure that the coating is intact. And then particular attention should be paid to the bottom connections on the tank. Here's a water draw. You want to make sure there's no weeping or leakage from any of the bottom connections. Just kind of give the tank a complete, thorough, overall visual inspection. Then we would want to check the tank foundation. These tanks are on concrete foundations. Some of them are on timbers. With the concrete, you want to look for any signs of cracking or spalling, any failure of the tank. If the ground around it was starting to erode, you may have to do some regrading to support it well. With a timber foundation, you want to check for any rot, splitting, cracking of the timbers. You want to make sure that the tanks are well supported so that they stay level, intact, and don't place undue stress and strain on the liner through differential settling. Okay, now we're going to go up on top of the tank and inspect the appurtenances to make sure everything is properly operating and intact. Okay, now we're on top of the tank. We're going to check all the piping connections and the appurtenances on the tank. One of the most essential items found on top of the tank is the vent. This assures the tank does not overpressure or draw a vacuum. He's checking the tank to make sure that the screens are clear all around the vent and that there's nothing obstructing it, and he's brushing a few bugs and a little dirt off. There's a screen typically on the top for the air coming out, and then there's one on the bottom for the vacuum relief where it takes air in. And if that vent was not operating properly, you might hear the tank oil canning, kind of ballooning as it pressurizes, or you might notice a little bulging or concave sinking in of the ends of the tank. And that would be an indication that this device was not operating properly and would need to be replaced. Okay, the tanks also are equipped with emergency vents, which relieve pressure in the event of a fire. They are pretty much a non-functioning thing except in the case of emergency. It's a good idea to check and make sure that they're free. They're a heavy lid, but they should be free to lift up like that. Check all the piping connections on the submersible pump. We'd want to go over and look that over thoroughly, make sure there's no leaks, any weeps from any of the piping, and check all of our electrical connections, make sure everything is intact and sound, that nothing is loose. Check our float switch, make sure it hasn't been damaged or anything's happened to it. Then we'd want to check the clock gauge. Periodically that is calibrated. You just want to make sure it appears to be reading. Check, make sure the cover's in place and the back cap is solid and in place. The gauge hatch, we want to check that, make sure the lid is on and secure so we don't get any water in that. And then if there are any extra connections, you want to just make sure all those are properly capped and tight so we're not getting any water leaking in the tank through those. Okay, now that we've completed our inspection of the tanks, we're going to go through the piping system, and we're going to start our piping inspection at the marine header. In this case, again, it's within the tank farm, but on most facilities this would be remote. So you would walk down to the marine header. You want to check and make sure that the caps are intact and tightly in place. If this were outside of the fence security area, these caps should be locked or wired shut just to prevent any vandalism. We're going to check all the valves, look for any evidence of any leaks or weeps occurring at any flange joints or from the valve itself. Make sure that these valves are closed. These valves would only be opened during a marine delivery, so it's obvious that valve is closed and we're good to go there. Then we would walk the pipeline from the marine header all the way up to the tank farm, check the supports, check the piping. Now we're going to go through within the tank farm and inspect the actual piping itself. You look at all the weld joints, see for any evidence of weeps or leaking, and then particularly threaded joints would be a real common place where you might see a leak develop. So you want to check that, make sure there's no leaks at any of that. All of the flange joints should be checked. Any flange within the piping system, we'd want to go through and look and see if we have any leaks coming from any flanges. Now, flex connectors, we want to check those. Look for any evidence of any kinking, bending, or any broken wire on that. Any flex connector that appears to have been damaged through movement or through something banging into it, you'd want to replace that in its entirety. And then we got to check all the pipe supports. Make sure everything is secure, that none of the pipes have come loose, that everything is good and sound and tight. And then we want to check the valving. We want to make sure that the valves are not leaking, and then we want to check, and it's a good idea on the monthly inspection to operate the valves just to make sure that we don't have any problem with an individual valve. So just a simple open and close will suffice. Now, it's very important on the inspection to go through and check all the valves and make sure that they are in the proper position. Most valves in the tank farm should be closed. In this tank farm, all of the main tank valves are left closed and locked, except we have one tank at the far end that the valve is actually left open. That's done because that tank is supplying the day tank, so it needs an automatic feed. So that one's left open, the rest are left closed. We review all of the valve tags, make sure we're familiar with the instructions. You know, here's one, normally closed. We want to make sure that this valve is closed and locked. And so give it a good thorough inspection. Okay, other items that you would inspect as part of the piping system will be the strainers. Again, just looking for any leaks. The strainers have a connection with a drain on the bottom. Want to make sure we aren't getting any leakage from there. The pump, we should check the pump. The piping connections on the pump, look for any leaks. And then the pumps also have a mechanical seal where the electric motor hooks onto it. If the seal were to begin to fail, we'd see leakage coming out of here. That would mean it was time to replace this pump. Also, just look for any mechanical damage to the pump. If anything had come loose, if the covers were loose, check the electrical connections, make sure those are solid. Okay, other items that would be commonly checked on the piping inspection would be filters, meters, hoses, and nozzles. And we'll go over to the bulk transfer area to look at those items. Okay, on the way over to the truck loading area, we're going to inspect the piping along the way. Again, just checking for any signs of any leaks in any joints, checking the pipe supports, make sure everything is secure and sound. This one, it looks like the ground's beginning to erode away. After a while, this support would get loose, so it'd be a good idea to bring in a little gravel and shore that up. Okay, now we're going to go over and just check the whole system here. So we'll check the hoses. We're going to look at the swivel joints for any signs of leak, make sure the connections are tight and secure, that the swivels operate freely. I'm going to check the hoses thoroughly, look for any signs of any weather cracking. If a hose is even the least bit showing signs of wear and cracking, they need to be replaced. You don't want to have one of these break during the middle of a transfer. So thoroughly inspect all of the hoses. Check the meters. Make sure that everything is intact, everything's solid. Any sign of a leak would show up as a weep on the base. So check the base, look for any signs of any drips or leaks around that. Check all the valving and piping connections all around the hoses. Make sure everything is intact. Good idea to exercise the valves like we did in the other locations. Just make sure they all operate properly, that the handles are free. Check the filter. Look around the filter for any signs of leaks, the connections to it, the base. Check the plug, and also check around the top. Make sure the gasket is secure. There's no weeping on the top. And it looks like everything is secure here. Check the static grounding reel. Make sure that's still intact. Check the wiring. See that it's not frayed or coming loose. The ground clip, that it's still functional and operating. And we're pretty secure here. Okay, in addition to the bulk transfer system, we also need to check all the piping, hoses, and etc. at the dispenser. First thing we'll do is we'll check the security enclosure, make sure all of our fencing or security is intact. Check the warning signs, make sure they're all tight and in place. Looks like everything is secure here. Gate. Then we'll go inside, give the dispenser a very thorough inspection. Look it over just like we did for our normal daily startup, and just make sure everything is intact. Look for any signs of leaks. Again, check the conduit, the electrical system, make sure everything is tight and secure. Check the fire extinguisher. Fire extinguisher is charged and adequate. We'll check the hose, nozzle, make sure everything is secure. Look for any signs of any leaks or weeps on any of this. Everything looks good. Also, note that the fluorescent light is on. The control systems are always designed so that even when you shut down the control panel at night, the lighting remains on in the dispenser. This is important. The lighting actually provides warmth to drive off moisture and helps protect the electronics or the mechanical devices inside the dispenser. If you notice that the fluorescent light is flickering or beginning to get dim, then you would have to get into here and actually replace the fluorescent light. So on a periodic inspection, just check that, make sure the fluorescent light is still operating properly. Okay, in the vicinity of the dispenser, we also want to check the electrical system, check the emergency fuel shutoff, make sure the sign's intact, and check all the conduit and the piping leading to the dispenser, make sure it's intact. It's also a good idea to check the concrete slab, look for any cracks, see if we're having any problems. If the ground is eroding around it and creating a sharp edge, we may want to regrade around here to create a smooth approach. As part of the piping inspection, we want to check the paint and for corrosion, flaking, peeling. Here's a joint where it appears that the paint has been peeling off and we're getting some rust in there. So this is an area that's going to need some attention. The painting must be performed in warm, dry conditions. And it's very important before touching up any paint to thoroughly brush the area, remove all the loose paint, remove all the rust, make sure you get down to good clean metal, prime it, and then coat it. And follow the instructions on the paint. They'll typically have it on the can or with the literature that comes with it. Okay, in conjunction with the piping inspection, we also want to inspect the electrical system. All the conduit, make sure, the same as the piping, we want to make sure it's properly supported, everything is secure, tight, and sound. Seal fittings such as this, we want to make sure that the plugs are in place and tight, all the joints are tight. Any junction boxes, we want to make sure those are sound, that the covers are on tight. Liquid tight flex connectors. These are important to check. Again, like hoses, they can be subject to weathering and they can crack. So you want to make sure those are tight, secure. Inspect them all for any weathering and cracking. The piping system will typically be grounded. This is to prevent any static electricity from forming in the piping. So make sure all those ground connections are solid. Follow the ground wire down, make sure it's still connected to the ground rod, and verify that everything is intact, that there's nothing broken or loose in the electrical system. Okay, we're over at the control panel now, and this is the kind of the heart of the electrical system. And basically, inside of this control panel are relays, contactors, other control devices. There's also a load center with circuit breakers for all the individual pumps, lights, and various devices. Typically, the things that are inside this control panel do not need to be touched unless there's an electrical failure. Usually you'd have a skilled journeyman electrician perform any work that had to be performed inside the control panel. This control panel is locked closed, which is a really good idea. This keeps it secure. Okay, the basic inspection would include just looking at the lights and the switches, seeing for any damage. The switches are typically equipped with a weatherproof boot on that. You want to make sure those aren't cracked, that the rubber's intact so they're sealing properly. It's a good idea to operate the it's a good idea to open up the control panel cover and make the same inspection on all the devices that are inside. Look for the lights, make sure they're not cracked. Check the glass, the window, make sure everything's intact, nothing's cracked, that the gasketing is tight. And so everything looks good here. As part of your inspection, make sure that you've got control power. This is part of the daily routine, but it's a good idea just to make sure that the main control power system is working. Then I would also check all of the electrical connections to the panel. Make sure everything is tight and sound, secure. Okay, the last portion of the physical facility that we have to inspect is the secondary containment system. This tank farm is enclosed by a secondary containment dike. It's got a liquid-tight liner on it. Here is the drain sump. Some facilities may just have a low-point drainage area or a sump like this. This sump has water in it. That's a very good sign. Basically, anytime there's a rain or any snow melt, any precipitation, we should see water appear in the sump. If you don't get water in the sump, it means you have a failed liner, and that's a serious problem, and it's going to need to be addressed. So here we have water in the sump. That's a good sign. When the water level gets high to where it's starting to come up above the surface of the ground, then we would need to pump the water off. That's covered under another section. But on the monthly inspection, we want to make sure we're holding water. Then we want to check the liner containment area. It's supposed to be kept clean of any debris, any vegetation. Here we've got some weeds that have kind of grown up in the tank farm area, so we'd want to remove all of that. We're starting to get some leaves accumulating. We should rake that up, just get all the combustible materials out of the secondary containment area. Then we want to inspect the entire perimeter of the dike, go around and look for any areas where the liner may be exposed, where there could be subject to damage. So on this one side of the liner over here, we have a vertical wall, and this is an installation you'll see number of cases. The liner has a sheet metal cover on it, and we just want to make sure that that sheet metal cover is intact. That's protecting the liner from exposure. Okay, on the other sides we have earth and fill. We want to make sure that there's plenty of gravel in place on the sides of the dike so that there's no liner exposed. If you find any areas of exposed liner, you would want to cover that up because the earth or the sheet metal provides protection from ultraviolet rays, from the cold, and from traffic so that your liner doesn't crack and remains liquid tight. It's very critical to remember when doing any work inside of a line secondary containment area to be very careful about any punctures to the liner. You don't want to dig with a sharp shovel next to the liner. You don't want to use any stakes, any sharp objects. If you see any welding rod or any sharp pieces of wire or anything, get those out of there because anything that's sharp that could work its way down can puncture the liner and end up causing it to leak. As part of the monthly inspection, we also want to verify that our spill response capabilities are intact. Every facility should be provided with a spill response kit. Typically there would be maybe 4 or 5 overpacked drums like this stored somewhere in the vicinity of the tank farm, and they would typically have all the materials required for a spill response. Inside of it we would see sorbent boom, sorbent pads, and rolls of sorbent material. There would also be personal protective gear included in that. There also should be shovels, rakes, hand tools, some hoses, some kind of a pump, just the basic requirements for responding to a spill. Typically in the area of a tank farm there would also be either a portable spill contingency tank, an old tank that's been taken out of commission that's set aside that's there for spill contingency, or maybe a folded tank included in it. Something that if there's a large quantity of spilled fuel in the secondary containment area, you could pick it up and get it into a storage container. Okay, all these things need to be inventoried and checked. Any materials that are used between the last inspection, if you use sorbent pads for minor cleanup or for housekeeping duties, those should be replaced so that at any time you have a full inventory of your spill response equipment. Included in the above ground storage tank operator handbook is a checklist that you can use just to make sure. It's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the materials that you have in stock and then make sure you can put them in place. One of the important parts of spill response is government compliance. Around the facility you'll see signs that give the phone number for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. In the event of any kind of a spill event, you have to call them immediately and they will provide assistance. They have caches of spill response gear that's greater than what you would typically have at your facility at various locations around the state that they can help respond to. They also have emergency response contractors should that be needed. Part of your spill preparedness is also making sure that your documents are in place. Depending on the volume of fuel that you store and whether you have marine delivery or not, you would be required to have a EPA spill prevention control and countermeasure plan, a U.S. Coast Guard operations manual, and most likely a facility operations manual. Okay, these are fairly lengthy documents that contain a lot of information about spill prevention and spill response. The operators of the tank farm need to be familiar with the contents of these manuals. You need to know where they are at all times. There are inspection checklists and periodic testing requirements that need to be updated within the manual. It's important to keep these manuals current and up to date. Anytime any agency personnel from the Coast Guard or the EPA come into town, that's one of the first things they're going to want to see. So you need to have those manuals in a readily accessible place, and it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with them each month as part of the inspection process.